Hi there, Scrapbook.com. My name is Jaycee Gaspar. I'm a full-time scientist, part-time paper crafter, card maker, and content creator. And if you follow me on Instagram and YouTube, you'll know that some of my favorite categories of cards to make are floral ones. So here in the beautiful Scrapbook.com studio, I'm sharing 3 of my design secrets to beautiful floral compositions. For my first rule, I'm going to start with color, right? It's what gives you your statement on your floral cards. I like to pick somewhere between 3 to 4 colors just so that they don't get muddy or mess up your composition on your florals. So I have some Scrapbook.com exclusives right here. The rub-on transfers are actually fairly new to me, and I'm excited to say that I love these. They're so easy. If you are just starting out, I highly recommend that you at least pick these up because there's no commitment, and I can make at least 5 cards with just 2 of these sets here. But today I'll just be showing you an example of one of these, and that is this one right here. So you'll see I've picked a fairly simple floral composition where I've picked roughly 3 to 4 colors. So I have my orange palette, my peach palette, and I'm using gold and white as my sort of accent pieces on there. I'm going to start with the card base itself, and what I like about these 6x8 packets is that you get your background and your mat at the same time with just a few simple cuts. So with one of the 6x8 sheets of paper in the boho paper pack, I'm just going to cut this first side lengthwise on the 4 1/4 mark, your standard A2 size. And then again at 5 1/2. And we'll use these scraps, so be sure to hold on to these as you're crafting. And then with the smaller segment, you'll get a 3 3/4 and trim that down to 5. And by doing that, you get your A2 panel and the perfect 1/4 matting all around. So it's really easy to create this really framed floral arrangement. I'm going to use the Wild Blooms rub-on transfers just to make a really simple bouquet, just to start out with, nothing containing composition, just a simple arrangement concentrating on our color palette. What I love about the alignment mat is that it sort of caves into my neurotic tendencies. I like to keep everything very well arranged on my mat. So then I can use the A2 portrait alignment guide on the scrapbook.com cutting and alignment mat, and then arrange my 1/4 inch matting on the mat. Because we will rub on all the transfers directly onto our background cardstock. And I'm using the Scrapbook.com exclusive mint tape with the new dispenser. It's nice because it's a one-handed operation. If I'm holding my cardstock with one hand, I can easily pull my mint tape with the other. For my bouquet, I picked this landscape sort of field of dandelions to arrange on the bottom of my cardstock. And these rub-on transfers have a protective sheet on top with release paper on the bottom. I'm just going to cut around my shape. And the nice thing about these transfers is I don't need any glue. It's just the mechanical operation of rubbing the transfer onto the cardstock. And I will do this directly on both layers of this panel here that I have from the Boho Smooth cardstock. I'm gonna have to let this guy free. In your rub-on transfer is the high-end popsicle stick to rub on your transfers. I've tried other things like the Teflon Bolden folder. The popsicle stick is perfect for all the transfers. Don't need anything too fancy. And then when you're ready to rub on the transfer, just remove that release paper. Being careful to not touch the decal on the back. Then can gently lay it on top. And again, I have this on both layers. And once I have it aligned, then I can use the popsicle stick to transfer and rub the decal onto the cardstock. So as I'm transferring this on, like I mentioned, I'm keeping 3 to 4 colors in my palette. In this case, with the decal, I have maybe about an orange, yellow family, brown, green, and then of course the majority of my background is going to be this peach color from the cardstock pack. That's found exclusively at Scrapbook.com. So like I mentioned, I am rubbing both transfers onto the background and the front matte piece. This will give us some interesting dimension, which I'll touch back on in the third segment of this card making tutorial. But for now, I'm just really focusing on just the color. And yeah, we'll work on the dimension to make this floral card pop a little bit. Now, if you get any piece that doesn't quite make it down, just use your stick again, rub it down. And it's perfect every time, as long as you slowly peel it off. And you'll see right there, I got a little piece that doesn't quite transfer. That's all right. Just lay it back over, rub it on again, and it's perfect. Okay. Easy on that. So the thing that I like to do now that everything is still aligned is I'll rub the popsicle stick along these free edges just to get them off and adhered. And same with this forward mat. And that's why I use the mint tape, is to keep everything in its perfect place. Because once we add dimension to this, then it'll raise up and it'll align perfectly with the background piece, just for some interesting dimension on your card. I did dress up my arrangement in comparison to the full size here. So I added some further embellishments from the rub-on transfer pad. And again, I'm not really thinking about shape right now. I'm just trying to fill in my landscape here, field full of flowers. Throw in some of these. I think the rub-on kits are perfect for new crafters because there's not so much commitment when it comes to the rub-on transfers. You know, typically you have to get the inks, the stamps, and all the tools that come along with it. But if you just want to give crafting a try, card making a try, scrapbooking a try, I think these rub-on transfers are perfect because they don't take up a lot of space. That's the first and most important thing for me. But yeah, you can just get a feel for paper crafting, the wonderful world of paper crafting, and see if you like it or not, and continue to see other exclusives on the Scrapbook.com website. It's another element. And I am sort of hiding stems to continue the field if I can, especially with this dandelion, to make it look like it's still part of a continuous scene. Add in some of the critters, like this little honeybee. And this little dragonfly, just to sort of raise up this floral field. So right now I have my floral and background piece arranged on my cardstock. Now we can work on the third element. So I have my background, my floral field, and now I just need my coordinating sentiment. Scrapbook.com also has the rub-on transfers for sentiments. And there's just an array of really encouraging sentiments and any sentiment that fits a lot of occasions. So again, I'm just gonna pick one sentiment, and this is where the scraps come into play on this end. In my sample, I used the "You Are Amazing" sentiment. This time I'll just use the "Just Because," just for something different. And what I love about this mix is that there's gold foil in here. And that coordinates beautifully with the boho pack as well as the field of flowers that we have in our card already. I can cut around this, but what I'm going to do is I slid that half-inch portion behind the sentiment, and I'm just going to rub directly on this just so that there's less scrap to hang around. You can kind of see the rub-on transfer working its magic. And you can kind of hear it too, that ASMR crafting. Okay. There we go. Easy. Just look at that metallic shine. It's going to coordinate beautifully with this cardstock. And just to make things easy, you can certainly use a paper trimmer to cut down the edges of this. I wanted a more rectangular banner instead of the paint wash or the brush stroke sentiment. I'm going to use the Scrapbook.com exclusive shape die, the Heart 2-piece set. I'm going to use just this banner right here to die cut. There we go. So now I'll run this through just so I can get a pretty standard and rectangular sentiment banner to put on my card front. So to die cut my sentiment, I'm using the Scrapbook.com and Spellbinders Platinum 6. And I love the Magic Mat. I've replaced all my cutting plates with them. I have the 8.5-inch platform at home, and I love it. I've used my same one for probably much longer than I should have, but I get great use out of it. So here's that die cut banner. All I have to do is cut the straight edge on the other side, and then I'll be ready to assemble my card. So there we go. That's what it's looking like right now. So the reason for all this tape, what I'm going to do before I mention that is I'm going to score this mint tape real quick just so that I can flip this up, and it's still in that perfect 1/4 matting background area. The reason why I think everything coordinates really nicely at the Scrapbook.com website is the boho color cardstock, the 6x8 with the 6x8.5 sheets. If you cut them into fourths, and I kind of had to write it down on here. If you cut them into fourths, you get the perfect size mat for the 3 3/4 by 5-inch piece here. So you'll see that it, fits very nicely in here. I don't really waste any of my product with little scraps. So I can use the full sheet 4 times, including this one, to make perfect mats for other cards. And you'll see those examples many times later. But all I'm doing is peeling the release paper back on one side, getting it roughly center there. Pull the release paper back, and now I've made my little hinge here. So then all I have to do is flip this down, and I'm kind of very roughly following the alignment of my field of flowers already. And it's in the perfect place just to get that 1/4 inch matting all the way around. can remove this top piece. And then with the double-sided foam squares, I'm just going to raise my sentiment banner. And I'm using the alignment grid on the Scrapbook.com cutting mat, just visually trying to get a reference line to center and place the sentiment. And that's why I like using all the mint tape all over here. It doesn't leave any residue on my cardstock. It's a low tag, so I don't have to worry about things sticking too hard. And then this is ready to go on my folded note card base. I use the Tombow Mono liquid adhesive for all of my projects. And I also use it to glue down my card fronts to my folded note card bases. For my folded note card bases, I use Neenah 110-pound cardstock. And I cut it down to size myself. Here's the example we were working towards. Here's the card we just made. And again, to really just reinforce that, that theme of color and the technique of using color on your floral cards, I have two other examples using the Boho Smooth cardstock, as well as the Winter Florals rub-on transfer. So you'll see I use the sentiment rub-ons, the winter floral rub-ons, and of course the wild blooms that we just used on this first card. But there are so many ways to use these rub-on transfers just for really simple cards if you're just getting started, and everything coordinates so beautifully. If you want this red, white, and eucalyptus sort of color palette, it all works. And there's my 3 to 4 colors, and I'm using that 4th color as my advantage for embellishment on this card. In fact, there's my 4th area, just so that there's some nice embellishment and shine that helps lead your eyes to this I love you sentiment. And I cut that sentiment banner again from the rub-on transfer, just making my own little banner for this arrangement. And same with this arrangement. So I arranged them in a wreath. I've been loving this faux washi tape theme while I was making all of these cards, but then I made another sentiment banner to put on the front. So that's colors. So we just talked about color on your card. The next thing that I like to spend a lot of time on and really focus a lot of energy and creative design on is line and shape. So it's what really gives your card a little bit of structure, something to really focus on. So in the last example, we looked at a field of flowers, but in this case, we're going to focus on lines and shapes just to give your card and focal element a sort of structure. Of course, I think one of the pioneers in floral card making is Altenew, and I'm using the stamp wheel today just to show you how easy it is to create a really full and linear shape looking arrangement. The stamp set I'll be using is the Golden Days stamp and die bundle, and I'll also be using Altenew's new formulation, the fresh dye inks, to color and coordinate these this bouquet. So just like the last example, I'm using 2 colors in this case to color my card, and I'll show you really easily how to set up the stamp wheel. So we've already removed the acrylic protection, as well as the stamp wheel sticky mat is on the stage. And then I'll use just a normal piece of A2 size cardstock, and it sticks directly onto the sticky mat. And if you're not familiar with the layering schematic found inside the Altenew packaging, all of the letters and shapes can be found here, as well as little reference guides to show where to align and position your stamps. And that goes for the floral and foliage elements. I say it's always easiest to start with the outline. So I'm picking a reference point right here, and I'm using the top left corner anytime I position my cardstock. So you'll always see me push the cardstock to the topmost and most left part of the stamp wheel stage. And once I have my stamp positioned like I normally would for any acrylic block, I'll put my stamp wheel flip plate on top to pick up the stamp. And I like to hold my stamp wheel flip plate at the 3 o'clock and 9 o'clock positions on the 16 wheels, or 16 points, but still the 3 o'clock and 9 o'clock positions here. Flip my plate and slide it back into the stage. So then here are my fresh dye inks. I picked this set of 4 colors just because they coordinate beautifully. It's from lightest to darkest value. So I have my lightest pink to my darkest red here. And I'll start with my darkest color. So this is Grapevine from Altenew. And I'll just very simply ink up the stamp. I've used my stamp many times, which is why it's got this sort of lovely blush glow to it. And then again, I like to grab my flip plate from the 9 o'clock and 3 o'clock positions, flip the plate, lock it into the stage, and press down. And there's my first impression. I'm going to use the stamp chamois to clean off my stamp. And that's important as we move on through these layers, just to avoid some transfer onto other parts of the cardstock. So I'm not going to remove my stamp from this point because we're going to be repetitively stamping this image onto the stamp wheel. So here was my first alignment. I'm going to do a quarter turn, and it might be easier to see. I'm looking at the crosshair in the center of the flip plate. So I'm constantly keeping it in that plus sign orientation, and that's going to help me align the next 4 layers on the stamp wheel. So now that I'm back to the plus sign, then I can align my next image to the outline of Golden Days. So that's the A2 segment. And I'm following reference points found on the stamp. And after you have used a bunch of Altenew stamps, you kind of get a feel of what it's supposed to look like. So now that I have my A2 layer aligned to the A1 outline layer, then I can pick up the stamp again on the flip plate, keeping my plus sign orientation on this on the flip plate. Pick up the stamp and then flip it right on over to expose the stamp side, the ink side. And then the next color I'll grab is Frosty Pink. And if you don't get perfect saturation on the first time, this is the great thing about this stamp positioning type tool, is that you can re-ink it again just by exposing the photopolymer side of the stamp. And then bringing it back over to your image. And that's much better. Okay. So again, another quarter turn of the stamp wheel will expose an open edge to your flip plate. Then I can grab the next layer, the A3 layer to Golden Days, and use the reference points to align this next image. And once I have that perfectly aligned, pick that up with my flip plate. So then we'll move down the line of value. The next color I'll grab is Coral Berry. To build my image. So we're almost done building up this flower. Then I can grab the final A4 layer of the petal portion, align it to the reference points on my image. Then we'll go to the next quarter turn of the flip plate and pick up the stamp. Okay. So we used Frosty Pink, Coral Berry. We'll move on to Ruby Red. And again, this is the A3 layer of the rose image. I'll do that one more time just to get perfect saturation. And so that's our completed rose image using Golden Days. Now, in my sample card, I have 2 blooms. We've done a lot of the meticulous task of aligning all of our stamps onto our stamp wheel. Now we can simply repeat the process of stamping because we're all set to repetitively ink and stamp the image all around the stamp wheel. And that's one of the beautiful things about the Altenew stamp wheel is that you can really batch process if you like to do that for bulk card making. And I can do this again on the same panel. So my top left reference point comes into play. I can remove my cardstock from the sticky mat, turn it 180, and pop it into that corner. And now this whole area right here is exposed for stamping again. Before I start inking, I'll make sure that all of my stamps are clean. I'm going to repeat this process with the A1 through A4 layers off camera, and I'll show you the end result of these 2 blooms on my cardstock. So I've stamped all 4 images for the second flower, this top left one up here, but I used it in a different variation just to get a wider range of value in the bouquet. So on the first flower, I used the full range, Frosty Pink, Coral Berry, Ruby Red to Grapevine. And then this second iteration up here, I used the outline in Grapevine, the A2 layer in Coral Berry, the A3 layer in Ruby Red, and then the A4 layer in Grapevine, just so I have a much more dynamic and full range in my bouquet. So in order to support and create that line and shape that I was talking about for this bouquet, I'll add the foliage elements, and you can see the completed layers down here in the die set. So I'll move my red inks over and pull out the other fresh dye inks from Altenew. This is part of the Greenfield set, but in this set is Frayed Leaf, Forest Glades, Evergreen, and Jet Black. So I recommend these 2 sets together if you're just getting started. They're a great set to start out with for beautiful florals. And of course, they always coordinate with the Altenew stamp sets. And just like before, we will ink up and stamp these images in order according to the layering schematic in the product trifold. So right now in my stamp wheel, I have the B1 layer. To stamp this layer, I'll use Jet Black. So there's that B1 outline. Then I'm aligning the B2 layer. The foliage layers are always much easier to align for Altenew. And again, I'm doing that quarter turn, following that plus sign on the flip plate. For the B2 layer, I'm starting with Frayed Leaf as my base for this leaf. Quarter turn again. pick up the B3 layer of the stamp set. For the B3 layer, I'm using Forest Glades. And then for the B4 layer, I'll use Evergreen for the last bit of depth to this branch. So that finishes the alignment portion of this cluster of leaves. Then I can rotate my panel again 180 degrees. So I'll go ahead and repeat that portion off camera on this segment of my cardstock. So I have my finished panel, and on this darker segment, I used jet black for the outline, and I omitted frayed leaves. So I moved from Forest Glades to Evergreen to jet black for my 3 detail layers. So that's B2, B3, and B4, just so that I can get that wide dynamic range of color within the palette. It's not all the same brightness, it's not all the same darkness. So now off camera, I'll work on using the coordinating dies to cut out these images, and you'll see they align perfectly. So now that I have everything cut out, here are my 2 floral images, my 2 foliage layers, and off camera, I went ahead and did my sentiment piece here. I just stamped Be Kind in jet black. And now we'll work on putting this all together. So like I mentioned earlier, we're going to focus on more of a shape and structure to this bouquet. Again, it gives a much more definitive focal point to your flowers, just so that your recipient has something to admire and look at. And my favorite shape to go for is a triangle. I think it fits really nicely on an A2 cardstock panel. And again, I'm using the reference lines on the Scrapbook.com cutting mat, just so that I can arrange everything on here. I always advocate to cut apart pieces just so that you can have more control in your foliage layers. I like to arrange my focal elements first, so the 2 flowers, and then frame the pieces with extra foliage layers. So right now, here's my main structure, this triangle. And when I'm doing this at home, sometimes this takes me upwards to maybe 20 minutes of just continuous fussing with the arrangement, just so in my mind I can get it perfect. Some other things to point out as I arrange this is, just like a healthy bouquet, you want all your elements facing upward, right, towards the sun, and like they're well watered. We don't want any wilty sort of arrangements. So everything looks perky, it's upright, it's facing towards the sun. And how do we get this onto our cardstock, right? Everything is so meticulously placed on here. That's what I know this is used for this MISTI, but I like to use it as sort of a pickup tool. So I have everything aligned on the mat. I can use the sticky side face down. So in order to pick up this arrangement, I'm following the grid lines on the workspace mat to the Clearly Amazing mat, and I can pick everything up at the same time. I'll just need to gently burnish this on here. So after I finish burnishing all the exposed areas of the cardstock, slowly peel off the mat. And now everything is held in place. And then we can work on making the background to this card. So again, I have another piece of folded Nina Solar White in 110. And I like to add a lot of dimension on this card. I'll go ahead and do that now. And directly on the Clearly Amazing mat, I'll apply my liquid adhesive to all my foliage layers. And this one is the 3mm foam adhesive strips. And I'm applying this to the floral images. And I'm applying this to the back of the floral images. For a little drama, I like to double it up. So for my most foreground flower, just add another layer. just like that. So hopefully, yep, you can see that there are 2 stacks on one of the flowers. Then with my folded note card base aligned to my cutting mat, I can bring this whole arrangement and follow the grid lines again. Bam. And I can slowly peel this back. And everything is where it's supposed to be on my card front. To break up the linear space of this, I like to add a lot of splatter. I think it helps fill in white space without really adding an extra element to the card front. So in order to create the splatter, I'm using one of the Scrapbook.com scrapers, just so that you can see it really easily on camera. And I'm using gloss black, pops of color. And I'm using this to create some black splatter. And then I added water to the pops of color. And I'll use a water brush to dissolve that and create a saturated ink. I like to follow a line, so I'm going to go from this point to this point across my flowers to add splatter. So top left, bottom right. I always advocate for a lot of splatter, so I think the more the better. Then I'll use the foam strip again to raise and mount my sentiment banner that I stamped earlier. And what I'm doing is tucking that within the shape of the triangle so that it's all one cluster of flowers and sentiments. So again, that was the example with Golden Days floral stamp set. I have 2 more examples just to show you this iteration of shape. Here's one with a more diamond formation. And I embellished this one with a few of the Spring Sprigs stamp and die set. And this is the Poinsettia and Berries stamp set from All To Do. And then here it is again with Golden Days. I did add the other foliage layers to really fill out this floral bouquet. We talked about color, and then we talked about line and shape. This next segment, we're going to talk about structure or form. You'll see this reoccurring theme throughout these cards, but I used foam adhesive to really raise up certain elements on the card, and I think that really helps distinguish a background, foreground, and your sentiment. So let's get started on that one. I already cut this A2 panel from the boho sheet. The boho smooth cardstock does come in an A2 panel if that's more your liking, but I cut this one down myself. And on here, I'm going to work on my background. Like I said, I love the rub-ons. I've been using them a lot lately. So I'll grab this floral wreath circular element and rub that onto my background. I've cut out the images that I need for the wreath, and I'll place that in the center of this cardstock background. Again, I'm using the alignment lines on the mat to get that as center as I can. And then use that popsicle stick one more time to transfer that image to the background. Now that my wreath is down, I have a panel of acetate. This is cut to 3 3/4 by 5 inches. And it's just like the other card from earlier, the first card. It's that same dimension because I like that perfect 1/4 inch margin for an A2 size panel. And I'm overlaying that and centering it to the background. And then again, I'll use the Scrapbook.com mint tape to hold this down and create my hinge for later. In the Wild Blooms rub-on transfer sheets, I'm grabbing these 2 images right here, the mirrored segments, and I'm going to cut those out and transfer them to the acetate sheet. going to work on my most foreground element to this card directly on the acetate. The nice thing about acetate is for the rub-on sheets is that they work really perfectly. Any smooth surface, you can transfer these images directly onto them. So with this heat-resistant acetate, they're available on Scrapbook.com. I'm going to use the You Are Amazing sentiment. And align this sentiment to the center of the wreath. And again, this is right on the clear acetate sheet. Now that I have my sentiment placed in the center of the wreath, then I'll frame this with the two symmetrical portions that I have here. So I wanted to put that down first so that I made sure I had enough space to fill in the top and the bottom segments of the wreath. And again, this acts like my structure or my form to this bouquet. It gives a lot of dimension and interesting texture to this arrangement. So I always advocate for adding a bunch of layers on the card. So I'm going to rub these on real quick, as well as the bottom segment, and I'll come back and show you the final result. So the real magic happens on this bouquet when we start lifting and distinguishing background from foreground. So that's why I like to use the mint tape hinge technique here to peel off the acetate, but leave it in its perfect placement. I'm using the foam squares, the small ones, to hide and tuck in these foam squares behind the larger flowers, behind the sentiment, because you won't really see them. And once I have enough foam squares on the back of the acetate, then I can just flip it down. It's in its perfect placement. Remove the mint tape. And now this bouquet, although there's a lot going on, there's a lot of structure to it. You have your foreground elements, there's sentiment, and the wreath in the background that helps really fill in this card space. I have other examples of this to show you. So here's a similar version of this card that we just made, just a different sentiment. And I did fill in this wreath with other floral elements from the rub-on set. Another acetate version, this time with a little bow embellishment. And this one comes from the Winter Florals rub-on set. Like I mentioned earlier, this sticks beautifully onto vellum. So I have this sort of arrangement that wraps around like 3/4 of the card. And then I added the sentiment onto some vellum and raised it up with, again, the little foam sheets cut down. And I went sort of rub-on crazy, and I did 5 more cards on this, including this one, showing you that from one sheet you can really make 5 other cards featuring the rub-ons and as well as other sentiments. I made this little washi tape banner, full washi tape banner with some of the smaller embellishments, just to break up the symmetry in this card, for example. Give a little bit of a different anchor point down here. And so you can truly use all of the smaller images on these rub-ons. So yeah, so those were 3 elements in creating beautiful floral cards. So to recap, we did color, line and shape, and form. So I hope you have a good time looking at the Scrapbook.com website. Don't forget to check out the description box for other materials that I used, as well as some of my favorite brands. And I hope to see you again very soon.